Welcome to Venturi's Voice. If you like the show and would like to hear more from us, give us a follow on your favourite streaming platform. Welcome to the show, guys. Today we're joined by David Lawanda, who is Director of Mobile Engineering at Major League Baseball. It's great to have you join us today. I'm sure you're very busy, so thanks for taking the time to sit down with me.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
It's cool. Pleasure. To get us started, could you give us a bit of background on yourself and a bit about your route into the world of technology?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up as a child of the 80s. My father was an accountant and a controller of a construction company, and they had computers in the office. And I would go with him actually about this time of year during tax season on the weekends when he was working overtime to prepare the taxes. And, would help him out. He would pay me out of the petty cash drawer to, initially it was just, copying and shredding old documents, but it later became doing things like bank reconciliation on these old computer systems, even predating the Microsoft DOS and Windows days. I received a computer at home when I was 13 and really took to it, really just was an eye-opening experience. A year later, got a modem and got online, went on American Online, when they were mailing floppy disks all over the world, all over the country at least. And it really just it fed my love. The idea that I could control this machine through code was a thing that was pretty revolutionary. I ended up taking a couple of years of computer science in high school, which was relatively unique at that point in the late 90s. Ended up going to the university at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, majoring in computer engineering, which was sort of split between hardware and software engineering. Wasn't sure which way I wanted to go. And that, picking one of those two directions. Eventually, after many courses, decided software engineering was the route for me. Ended up getting a master's degree and left school in 2003. Obviously, this was before, the iPhone and mobile had taken root, and started out more as an embedded systems engineer, building my first job out of school as a Department of Defense contractor, building communications software for the Department of Defense, the U.S. military. Did that for a couple of years. It wasn't exactly Mission Impossible, or as sexy as it might have been imagined. So at that point, I pivoted away from that. Took an opportunity to work in a television broadcast equipment company, making servers and equipment that went to companies such as CNN, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and those type of things. We had a bunch of equipment I remember the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver was one spot. But when that area in that domain sort of dried up after the switch from digital from analog, and that's around the time mobile was also becoming a thing. I really thought I had an opportunity to go work for a startup in Philadelphia. I'd lived in the Philadelphia area after school, and working on some consumer networking software that we initially built for desktop, but kept sniffing around mobile. I guess I remember it was right in 2009 I bought my first MacBook Pro and an iPod Touch, thinking I'd do some exploration on my own into mobile development. And then my son was born, and that all went out the window to some degree. But later I was able to pursue a job in New York City with Samsung. And that was my first opportunity to really dip my toes actually on the Android side. But I've always been an Apple aficionado, and pivoted from there into iOS development at Birchbox, and then later, joining MLB back in 2017. And so it's been just about 4 years now. The last 2.5 to almost 3 years, I guess in May it'll be 3 years, as the Director of Mobile Engineering, responsible for the app formerly known as AtBat, that's been in the App Store since the day the App Store launched. We rebranded as the MLB app early in 2020 for better fan recognition, but it is our keystone product for the touch point with MLB fans across the country and even internationally. I know we sent MLB to London back in 2019, and we were supposed to do it again last year in 2020 before the pandemic got in the way. I've been a baseball fan even longer than I've been a technology fan. Wow. Going back to my early childhood and with my dad. So, being able to combine those two together has been a really great opportunity.
That's really interesting. I mean, you've obviously had a love for the industry for a long time, or technology for a long time since you were very young. And I've got a couple of things that I want to ask. And one of them is, what still excites you about it?
I think a lot of it is just how amazing it is, what we've accomplished. I have two kids at home, almost 10 and almost 12-year-old. And the fact that any question they have, I can answer for them. We have a Google Home that we can, hey, Google, and it'll, chirp back at us whatever we're looking for. The fact that I can, I've got some smart home stuff set up that, really makes the house feel alive and intelligent, the fact that we're carrying these supercomputers in our pockets or even on our wrists that are more powerful than the computers that sent a man to the moon 50 years ago is mind blowing. And just being able to continue to take advantage of that, explore, things that you think back, even in my childhood, what it would be like without that is so hard to imagine.
Mm-hmm. It is genuinely unbelievable, isn't it? And I find that technology is speeding up. It's all the time there's new technology, and not just small developments. There's some technologies that are coming out which are huge. It's amazing to be a part of. And I was also wondering, as you've been working in technology for pretty much your whole life, really, and I've realized that you have to constantly be learning about tech to stay working in it. So I was interested to find out what resources you rely on to continue to learn.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a challenge. And part of it is knowing, obviously what the next thing is going to be. Mm. But also part of it is, trying to drink from the fire hose, of the internet. And you can find, like I said, you can find anything you want to know. You have to be better at vetting what's real and what's fake. Yeah, for a long time, it was buying the O'Reilly books, with all the animals on the covers and keeping those on a shelf. Then it was, been a lot of Stack Overflow. But at MLB, we're lucky that we have access to, O'Reilly, Safari Online, and Udemy. I've used LinkedIn Learning. I've looked at Coursera. I haven't used that one specifically. I know my kids have used Khan Academy for their schooling, and I read a lot of stuff on Medium. Try to find people I respect in the field and follow along. I think podcasts have come a long way and are contributing a lot to that as a way to keep up. We've purchased a spin bike, not the brand name you probably would expect, but similar one. And I listen to a lot of podcasts. I don't necessarily do the traditional spin classes as much, but want to just put it on a ride and listen to something like what we're recording right now and learn a lot about technology, software development, sports, other interests that and it's a really good way to engage. When I used to ride the train back and forth to New York prior to COVID hitting, again, podcasts were another good way, as well as those online resources I mentioned.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it, with podcasts? Because I find, they're a relatively new thing, really. They've not been around for that long. But I find you can absorb so much more information so much easier when you're just listening to a podcast. I don't know what it is. For me, podcasts are naturally and definitely the way that I would learn. And I don't know, it just seems like a much more natural way to learn about things, really. And I think, hearing people talk about things is an important aspect. And then also learning off other people is a big aspect of learning as well. Would you say that you learn off your peers?
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, certainly as far as that. I've had a number of opportunities to work with some really smart people at multiple different jobs where, I worked at one job where our chief architect could cite both the C++ spec chapter and verse and the MPEG spec chapter and verse. Wow. He had the bit manipulations in his head, and he wrote it. He wrote his own parser for this language we built as our interoperability, something similar to like Google Protocol buffers, an early version of that, which really simplified our development, and provided the contract for our API between our front end and back end. Yeah, again, multiple places. I worked with a hardware engineer at my first job when we were doing that, who was just extremely proficient at being able to lay out an FPGA and really understood that. And I really enjoyed getting an opportunity to work with him. I've never wanted to be the smartest person in the room. I actually would rather not be.
Yeah.
And I really have enjoyed that. Being in a room of some really smart people and working hard to try and keep up.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Never be the smartest person in the room. I find that really interesting. It's definitely true, though. I'm thinking as a director of mobile engineering, and obviously nowadays, we've got a lot more teams working remotely, even across the world. They don't even have to be in the same city or the same country. So I'm just curious, as a manager and a leader, how do you lead distributed teams? Is that a new challenge that you've had to face?
Yeah, no, it's something I've been dealing with for probably about 5 years now, since 2016, actively as a manager. I've worked on some distributed teams prior to that even, but as a manager specifically, back in 2016, I did a stint for about 7 or 8 months with a startup that I came into that had already formed. They were actually in not a great shape when I joined, and that's a lot of the reason why they didn't make it. But they had originally outsourced their tech. The two co-founders were in New York City, but they had outsourced the tech through a business connection the CEO had to a company or a development shop in Finland. They had one developer in New York, another developer they contracted through in London. After I joined, we ended up contracting out additional work to a group outside of Montreal and another group in Colombia. So we were, extremely distributed. And yeah, there's definitely some challenges there. I think the biggest challenge when you're distributed, more so than geography, is time zone.
Yeah.
When I joined MLB, we actually had a number of contractors on staff as well. We had folks in Barcelona and one in Mexico City, as well as folks in San Francisco. So we were stretching time zones from Central European time out to Pacific time, US, where there really was only 1 hour or 1/2 hour for stand up at noon Eastern. Was really the only overlap between Barcelona and San Francisco, as you can imagine. And that's where I think the challenges come when, obviously the tools we have like Zoom, like Slack, or, when you're working in an office these days, when these open floor plans, you end up on headphones, and the communication from a remote location isn't that much different than when you're sitting next to each other, when you're Slacking each other or Zooming with each other, as we've had to do. But when you're having to deal with time zones and trying to get people aligned where, the folks in, whether it's Barcelona or Finland, are starting their day super early, compared to East Coast and especially West Coast time. And, you need to make sure that if, you have folks reporting to you, they have assignments, they know what they can be able to get started while it's still way too early to be online with them. I think back to, there was one in that opportunity when I was working with the folks in Finland. I actually was going to a conference in San Francisco. I flew out late on whatever night it was. I guess it was probably a Sunday. And to arrive, so I could go to the conference Monday morning in San Francisco. But by the time I got into my hotel, it was just about like 8 or 9 a.m. in Finland. And the engineers were starting to wake up, and I ended up, they needed something, and I got involved in a conversation and ended up not getting to bed till like 2 or 3 in the morning Eastern time, which is what I was still on, but you had to make sure that they had what they needed to be able to stay productive. So making sure that those lines of communication, it often takes a lot of over communication. At least that's the way I bias towards, which can be hard. A lot of engineers are introverts by nature. I'm certainly introverted naturally, so they're not necessarily the most forthcoming or don't want to be disturbed by a manager. But I think that's part of what we need, because there is also some level of FOMO, fear of just being out of the loop. I think being fully distributed is an easier solution than semi-distributed, where you have folks in the office. That's where more of that FOMO comes out. If you've got, a core group that's in an office and, walk into the conference room and walk out of the conference room together, have those side conversations, or might go grab lunch after a meeting. And then you've got 1 or 2 folks who are distributed. You really have to pay attention to make sure those distributed folks don't feel subjugated or, not as important to the team.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there is difficulties with having distributed teams, like obviously, but do you think that the pros outweigh the cons?
I think there's definitely, there are a lot of pros, and I definitely think it allows for some really good opportunities. I think I don't want to say there's a absolute answer necessarily. I think you got to weigh your pros and cons. If you need some very specialized skills, being able to distribute so you can draw from the larger talent pool, that's, where you need somebody who's specific. Like I know at MLB, we have, some connected device platforms that, we support, like Roku, where there's a very specific skill set that, it's not like just knowing Swift or Objective-C or Java, or Kotlin for Android, where there's a much bigger talent pool to draw from. You need to be able to find those people. And if you can give the folks an option not to relocate to where we have an office, whether it's New York or our offices in Boulder or our offices in San Francisco, you get an opportunity to really draw upon a bigger talent pool. Also, having worked in the startup world, I think it gives you an opportunity to potentially save money. You don't have to pay New York or San Francisco or London salaries. If people get that opportunity to work in a secondary market that, where the cost of living just isn't as high. And I think that's the trend that's really, even some of the bigger companies appear to be exploring, what the pandemic has accelerated.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really interesting. And I completely agree. And also I was thinking it probably depends a lot on, you were saying it depends on who you're trying to hire and what skill set they need. And also it massively depends on the industry, really, what industries people are working in. I mean, I can imagine sales, and if you're in a sales environment, it would massively help to be in a sales environment surrounded by, your peers and people doing a similar thing. So yeah, It does depend. And I think engineering as well, and tech, it massively lends itself to working remotely. And it's amazing with the pandemic how quickly these tech companies have adapted, really. It was almost overnight, really. It was just such a smooth transition.
No, I mean, I can say certainly MLB is an interesting spot because we are the technology arm of MLB is very much more focused and aligned with the best practices of the large tech companies. We have folks who've come in from, who work at MLB who've been at Google or Amazon or Apple or Facebook at various times. So we're much more aligned with that. But the larger MLB organization is not. It's a lot of folks who are, there's big legal, sales, marketing, operations, events, who are much less familiar with the idea of working remotely. And even before the pandemic, the team I have, we were working remotely 2 days a week, Mondays and Fridays from home, and Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays in the office. That was a better setup for our team, and that even caused some consternation in the larger organization. Why would shouldn't everybody be on site? Shouldn't everybody be more closely aligned? That's not something that was familiar to that other those other operations or other teams within the organization. But I think for techs especially, I mean, I can even go back from 2007 to 2010. I was working for a company that we ended up going remote because due to acquisition, we were a small office and they moved us and consolidated us with a larger office that was going to end up, on a map as the crow flies, was not a huge, it was only about 50 miles, which was reasonable, I guess, to consider as a commute, but it required going through Philadelphia, which the traffic, if anybody knows Philadelphia, they know the traffic is insane. It was anywhere from an hour and 10 to 2 hour commute each way for me. And some folks even in the team were even further. So we went semi-remote where 4 days a week we worked remotely, and 1 day a week we got into the office, to have our meetings and have some of that FaceTime. And I think that worked really well. Actually, that's what I'd like to explore coming as sort of that hybrid model coming out of the pandemic, where people feel comfortable. They have their home office setups that they like to work in, the quiet solitude, since you don't get an office most, until you get to the highest of levels these days, and can do your best work. And then, once a week, if it's, if you're located like we are in the metro New York area, or even if it's a more distributed team, once a quarter, once every 6 months, have a junket where everybody gets together and can, have that FaceTime, get to know each other a little bit better, maybe go out and grab a beer if COVID isn't happening, and, can get that, but then can, redisperse and continue to function.
Yeah. And I've just been thinking about the benefit remote working has, with startups, because, if you think about startups like 10, 15 years ago, they'd have to hire a premise and, they're trying to save every penny, they can't waste a penny. So having like a cool office in the centre of, Manchester or wherever would cost a lot of money. So for startups, it must be like revolutionary, really.
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, I think we're heading in that way with, things like WeWork and the shared office spaces where you could, you could perhaps get it more cheaply, kind of similar to the, the cloud server model. Instead of, the more expensive option that was more traditional was to get your own office and decorate it yourself and have it in a spot, but then you're beholden to it. Then moving to WeWork is more like moving into an AWS or GCP type model where, you don't have to worry about the decorations. You just, you pay for what you need, the pay-as-you-go model. But I think we've further moved even beyond that to more like a serverless function is the analogy there of really just, maybe you rent a conference room, again, once a week as a startup to get your folks together, or once a quarter, or once a year. And then, otherwise, you disperse and work from your home. And the cost you save on utilities and coffee is monumental and game-changing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious to find out what some of the challenges that you found out when hiring mobile engineers to work on streaming platforms. Is that, it doesn't seem like it's a very common skill or kind of common thing that people would learn. Are they difficult to find?
It's definitely, having some experience there is good. I don't think it's a skill that's that overcomable, especially on the Apple platform specifically, where I've been working. Apple has done a really great work making those APIs pretty familiar and pretty easy to spin up on, assuming you follow the model. I mean, Apple designed and implemented the HLS spec, the HTTP live streaming spec that pretty much everyone's using these days for streaming. So as long as you're playing in that sandbox, it's not that hard that any good iOS engineer can't read the docs and spin up on. But, to get it working, the basic functionality. Obviously, the subtleties are in the devil's in the details of that. So definitely good to have some experience. At least in New York, we've had a decent opportunity recruiting people who've had experience one way or another. There are candidates to be had, given how big streaming is. You get a lot of the, whether it's a sports organization like MLB or the television networks, the big broadcasters, they've all invested in it. So I don't think it's terribly that hard. And again, a strong engineer should be able to pick it up. I think, what Apple at least does is they give you really two options at the opposite ends of the spectrum. You either take what they have and where they're, very opinionated and very specific, and make it really easy for you, basically package it all up but it looks like the way they want it to look, or they give you all the pieces, laid out on the bench for you, and you got to figure out how to put it together. If you want custom UI around how, what the button should look like, or what functionality you want it to do, when it comes to some of the more auxiliary pieces like AirPlay or Chromecasting, which you have to integrate with Google. That's where the complexities are. And if you're just dealing with clips of content, pre-recorded stuff versus live is definitely obviously harder, and those are the challenges. But a lot of it depends on the platform that's providing the media. At MLB, we're using the platform that had been built by MLB Advanced Media, but was later part of the spin-off into what was called BAMTech and the acquisition by Disney, and is the same engine that powers, or the same platform that powers Disney Plus and ESPN Plus that the folks who had worked for MLB originally built and sold as part of that about almost 4 years ago now.
Interesting.
But there's the other options there. The big players, whether it's something like YouTube, or I'm sure there are other of the big players in the game have their own Facebook Watch, Amazon Prime. These platforms are out there.
Some of the people that I've spoken to on the podcast, they say that a lot of their work wouldn't have been possible, or would have been very, very difficult without the cloud. I'm just curious to find out if you still rely on the cloud.
Oh yeah, for sure. We went through a major migration. The original build out in MLB was with AWS, but anybody who's been following the news in our space, or watches our content, knows we've done a big deal with Google. Now we're using GCP. I think we're still actually using both to some degree, although we've got a big deal with Google. And I think really it comes down to scalability, the ability to scale up and scale down.
Yeah.
Otherwise, similar to what we were just talking about with the office space, that analogy I made, the fact that you can scale up on demand without having to build out to the maximum cost. I mean, baseball is a very seasonal product. I'm not sure how familiar you are, but we start our season in April or late March. Most years, this year it's April 1st. And it goes through the end of the World Series, the championship ends just about the end of October. And it ebbs and flows through those 6 or so months, peaking, actually the most traffic is not during the championship series, but during the middle of the season when all 30 teams are playing. We'll have 15 games a night. Depending on which markets are doing well, if the bigger markets like New York or LA or Chicago, their teams are doing better, we'll see more traffic. Than if they're having an off year and the smaller markets are in front. So being able to scale on demand is really I think the benefit the cloud provides there, from my perspective, from where I've sat. Obviously, I'm not as directly involved with the back end piece there, but just knowing that we can scale up and support it when we need to is the big win.
Absolutely, yeah. Now I want to ask you talk a little bit about your career reflection, if we could look at that, and then maybe a bit of advice. So, you've had a lot of different jobs in your career, and I'm just interested to find out, how have you personally handled unexpected job changes, if you have?
Sure. Yeah, no, I definitely have a couple times, unfortunately. I mean, I think the biggest thing you have to do is you have to be proactive. You have to keep your, ear to the ground, listen to those rumblings. I've caught a couple before. They were unexpected. I made the move before the bottom dropped out, but a couple times I have been caught unaware of changes that were not my choice to leave. And I think beyond being proactive, it's also being your own best champion. Making connections, not being reticent to connect when people reach out to connect with you. At least networking, being willing to whether it's going to a meetup like we used to, I guess again before COVID, or even a virtual meetup nowadays. Reaching out, making connections. Being willing to be mentored and mentor with folks, not just in technology too, partnering with folks, whether it's business folks, product, sales, putting a good name out there so that when people think, oh, I need a technologist. Oh yeah, I remember that guy, Dave. I worked with him, or when you need something, you can reach out and, if somebody you worked with before is doing something interesting, you can ping them and they'll remember you fondly. And, if not, take you with them, point you in a direction where they might be able to help. Because I generally think most people are very much willing to help. They get it. They understand, you're looking at something. If they have a connection, they'll, be willing to make the introduction. At least that's been my experience. And, so I think we can, again, making sure that you don't get caught unaware when possible, which again, I think is part of it. But then making sure you have that network to fall back on when it does happen is the biggest learn for me.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that advice is kind of transferable across most industries, actually. I can't really think of an industry that it wouldn't be useful for. I think growing your network is a big one.
Right. I'd say the only other thing is also, I think you touched on it before, that, just staying up on technology, the challenges around, making sure you don't get, pigeonholed in. I mean, I guess even folks who pigeonholed, COBOL programmers became really important around the Y2K, after not being useful for 10, 15 years prior. Yeah. So maybe you get lucky, but I wouldn't want to count on something like that happening again. I started out again in the embedded system world where a lot of C++ and then Java. I sort of missed the web development, certainly the web 2.0, and I wouldn't consider myself strong in that area necessarily. But when I saw that, Google came out with Go and Apple came out with Swift around the same time in 2014, I knew that I needed to, bone up on that. I haven't as much time to invest in Kotlin, but I know that it looks enough like Swift that I feel like it's something I could pick up. So I feel like you just got to stay on top of these things, and whatever, you can't know everything. You certainly can't. It's too broad to try and do everything from, Rust to Go to Swift to Kotlin to, JavaScript, TypeScript, and all the things that, go along with it. But you got to pick a few things, become really broad. I think somebody explained to me, the shape of the letter T. You got to have enough breadth, but you also have enough depth in one specific area to, be able to own that and be ready to change, be ready to accept that, you might have to look for something if you do find that change that might not be exactly what you had been doing before, and be ready to move in that direction.
Absolutely. I mean, there's new technologies and frameworks and things coming out all the time. So how do you know what's worth investing time into? How do you know what's like just, a flash in the pan new technology that says it's the best thing, but then actually flops? And how do you know if it's like the next big thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. From my experience, and specifically having worked most familiarly in the Apple ecosystem, a lot of that is set by Apple. It's pretty clear when they start signaling things, like the team at work. We've been having a lot of conversations and doing some work early in Swift UI, or the new declarative UI framework that Apple released initially in 2019 and iterated last year to a second version in 2020. That's definitely been one of these things that we're trying to suss out. But similar to what we did when the move from Objective-C to Swift a few years earlier, is it a real thing? I think a lot of it comes from, if Apple says so, it is. Right. And you just have to be ready for it. But then again, I think there's a lot of things that are, even within the Apple ecosystem, we did some early exploration, some demoware, never productized, some work around ARKit back in 2017 that showed some potential, but we weren't sure it was really right for our business. The use case we had was, and I'd have to find the old articles that we got some press on it, at least. The idea that you could hold up your phone or your iPad, if you brought an iPad to a baseball game, which you probably shouldn't, and you could basically, using ARKit, provide the data overlays like you would if you were watching the game on TV. Like, what is this batter's batting average, or how many innings is this? How many strikes is this pitcher thrown, or that? And when it worked well, it was pretty cool. It was pretty revolutionary. But the same time we were working on that, there was a incident at the New York Yankees baseball game where a little 2-year-old girl was hit by a foul ball that, because she wasn't paying attention. Oh, wow. And we kind of had to table the conversation a little bit, because you really shouldn't, if you're at the game, you're there to watch the game. You should be enjoying the game. You shouldn't be holding your phone up in front of you for, minutes on end, not just for safety reasons, but, just general health and well-being. Maybe it's time to put the device away. So I think, figuring out, is it right? Just because it's out there, it may not be the right thing. I think, the old saying about if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. not to take this new shiny hammer that you found and try and hit everything that you with it. It looks like it might be a nail.
I've not heard that analogy before, but that's really good.
It's, the idea that you can, you should vet it. Is there a business use case, for the business you're in? I mean, sure, if you want to go off and do a side project, a hackathon type thing to learn it and appreciate it and, understand it, that's totally I think a valid use of time. That's one of these things that we have to do in the technology space, is make time for those things. But at the end of the day, you have to be ready to say no and say, this isn't the right maybe it'll be ready in a couple of years. This first revision of this new technology isn't what we need, but we'll come back to it. And, it's not a do or die on the first time you look at it.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. If you could think back to when you started out in your career, I mean, when did you start out in your career? Was it 1990?
2003.
Oh, 2003. So if you could cast your mind back to 2003 and look at David Luanda back then, is there anything you'd wish you were told back then that you've had to go on and learn the hard way?
I think there's definitely, besides the technical, staying up on things, being ready to pivot, being ready to, absorb change. I think a lot of it is the soft skills of working in a team, understanding how software is never done. I mean, my first job was tough because that was a hard bridge, because at that point we were building software that was going to be burned into ROMs that were shipped into satellites that were going into space that really couldn't be changed. You basically had to get it right the first time. But since then, working, whether it's anything consumer facing, where there's always another app update, there's always another rev of the software that's going to come around, whether it's new feature or bug fix, so figuring out how to pace yourself. I mean, obviously a lot of stuff in that time since I started, the agile methodologies have really come to become a popular way of building software, which I believe in a lot of those things. But one of the things that comes out of the agile, it's just the terminology of a sprint. The idea that you're expected to, this is a sprint. I think Scrum is great because it does feel kind of like a rugby scrum where you're all heads down, pushing the pile, doing that sort of thing. But the term sprint really rubs me the wrong way, because it's a marathon. And as we all know, you can't sprint a marathon where you're just going to burn out. And so figuring out how to be agile, and with a little a, not necessarily big A agile, but little a agile, to iterate and improve and know when to, cut it off the development for this phase and say, we're just going to push this to the next go round. Be willing to accept that it's not always going to be perfect. The old, the one saying we've been saying a lot recently is, don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah.
Or don't let perfect be the enemy of done. Get it out there, ship it. Obviously there's some cost to shipping things, maintenance and that sort of thing. But in the end of the day, the code that you ship is, what you have to hang your hat on. So, get it out there, figure it out. Minimum viable product is a risky thing for sure, because it quickly evolves and mutates beyond what that is. I think a lot of it is also knowing what code not to write. I mean, the best code you're ever going to write is the one you don't, because there's no bugs in code that you didn't write.
Yeah.
So knowing where to step away and say, this is, trying to over-engineer things. Another term that doesn't rub me the right way is clever. If you're coming up with a clever solution, you're probably doing it wrong. Because, whether it's you or somebody else is going to have to maintain that clever, and maybe they're not as clever as you are. And that shouldn't be a penalty on them. That's a penalty on you for not being, the clever solution is making it obvious and clear. I mean, I think the other big thing is just maintainability. Has got to be the number one driver of any long-standing code base. Sure, if you're building a side project, a prototype, and you're going to, just whip it together, like a homework assignment in college, that's one thing. But if you're building code that's going to, and which you should always assume it is, because every good prototype ends up shipping for the most part, that, whether it's yourself or anybody else is going to have to figure out what's not working right at 2 a.m, 6 months, a year, 3 years from now. You better be ready for that.
That is amazing advice. Yeah. You kind of blow me away a bit there. There's a lot to take in, but it's incredible. I think for one final question, maybe if I could ask, what advice would you give to mobile engineers who are looking to get into streaming? I mean, we touched upon it a little bit before, but what would the advice be?
Yeah, I think again, it's just, good fundamentals.
Yeah.
Good fundamentals of mobile engineering. I think a lot of streaming is one of the spots, where there is a long-standing path, I think, for mobile apps. I think, the initial spike and splash of mobile and, having an app for everything definitely feels like it's waned in the past few years after, from 2008 to 2010 to 2016 even, everything was just trying to go mobile, again, that hammer and nail analogy might apply. But since then, I mean, one thing that, you're just never going to get away from is quality streaming in a native app. So I think having a lot of just strong fundamentals. I mean, streaming is hard because you're pushing a lot of data, right now, whether it's 720p or 1080p data, soon will be 4K. That's a lot of data over. I mean, now obviously we've started to roll out 5G here in the States, and I know that's going worldwide. Offload some of that, but having lived and worked through the 3G and 4G generations, being aware of, networking can be tough, especially wireless networking, cellular networking, being ready to, and battery life, making sure you're not just, obviously these bigger phones have much better batteries than they did 3, 4, 7, 8 years ago, but still, being respectful of the user's, data usage and battery usage in a way to deliver the performance where you're not, pegging a processor or sucking up all the RAM when building your app is important because, streaming, if the app crashes in the middle of the stream, people are going to, the users are going to be really annoyed. If the app crashes, on a more, of a less long-term use app, I'm trying to think, even a banking app where, you're checking your balance or whatever, and the app crashes. All right, you relaunch the app and you get back in, and you can get, if it's a more stateless app, but streaming is much more stateful in that you're expecting it just to continue playing for whether it's a 30-second highlight clip from the game last night or the 3-hour game. You just want, if you're a fan of whatever sport, you're watching that game, you expect, you want to be able to enjoy it. And if it times out at the, when the winning home run is hit, that's going to be bad news for for your user. So it's fundamentals. It's just that, and that's where I think the embedded systems background that I brought to mobile, since I got into mobile a little bit late, was important. And I think anybody should be aware of, having worked on, Samsung TVs and, I've always been intrigued by the fact that there are computers in everything, whether you're building a car, or you're building a microwave or you're building a, home stereo, being, really aware of memory usage, CPU usage, battery usage is essential to delivering that quality experience that your users are expecting, not just planning for the best case, but certainly planning for the worst case scenario when the network is dropping out or, the battery is running low, or making sure you don't get to the, you're not the reason why the battery is running low.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And I'm just curious to find out a little, do you still love baseball as much as you did now that you work so heavily in it? I
think so. It's been great having my son, who's going to be 12 this year. Every time I, question, do I still have the same passion for it? Just watching him enjoy the product. I found a couple bugs for us over the 4 years. Hey, Dad, why does it say, why is the app doing this? Oh yeah, we should fix that. He's having him so invested is part of the reason, maybe even if I'm not loving the game, knowing that there are so many people out there loving the game and interacting with the game is important. And I still, I'll still enjoy the Yankees. I grew up a Yankees fan for the past 35 years. I'll watch baseball at any sport. It's an amazing game. The dynamics of it. I know it doesn't necessarily get as much respect as it once did. But I think I'll always be a fan.
Yeah. Well, it's similar to me with cricket, although I don't work in the cricket industry, but I'm quite obsessed. I'm quite a fanatic about cricket. I don't know if you ever watch it.
Sure. I mean, you get to know how the sausage is made, and that can, distract from that. But then I got a work trip to the World Series in 2017.
Wow.
The champion, which, if you're not familiar, that's the championship. Spent two games in Los Angeles. Very exciting in the MLB box. Got to wave to or even talk to a couple of my childhood idols, former players. So, I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. I mean, Again, if I'm going to do something in the technology industry, why not do that? Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Absolutely amazing. Yeah, I think that might wrap us up today, Dave. I mean, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. It's been phenomenally interesting for me, and I've taken a lot from this, and I'm sure the people that listen to this will do too. So thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks for listening to Venturi's Voice. If you like the show, give us a follow on your favourite streaming platform.